Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be.
Hi, folks. Another week goes by, as I seem to say far too often. Rick Wagner here, getting it right here on KZZ, KGLN. We're at 1100, 92.7, 980, and 101.3. We're on the internet. And we're doing podcasting, although I'm going to have to struggle a little bit with getting the podcasting out because one of the people that helped me out here has got another job, and so we're going to have to grind this out. Perhaps I can talk her into staying around, just taking care of this part of it because she does a good job. But anyway, so let's talk about something that's you feel every day, but isn't exactly left or right. It is political, but it's not left or right. It's not scandals or outrage, or it's just that, does it seem to you like things just aren't working very well? Does it seem like no one is particularly responsible anymore for anything? It's really about whether our institutions are being run by people that are competent, adults are supposed to be, allegedly. So, although I like to mention the collapse of the West, which we could be seeing, but I'm hoping it's just a drastic realignment, but that's not really part of it here. We're talking about this grind we're going through. I mean, everywhere you go, and all you folks out there during the holidays understand what I mean a little more, if you've traveled a little more adroitly, right? Delays, handoffs, getting all this phone trees, where you get in and it's like pushing one button after another and another button, when you feel like the real purpose of that is to just make you go away, not to make you help. And then, of course, you got to fill out a form so that you can perhaps get back on another phone tree. It's not that everything's broken exactly, it's just that it doesn't actually work very well. And why is that? I was thinking about that, and actually I was talking to some folks here locally about, some of the frustration of things just don't seem to be, well, there doesn't, as I said, it doesn't seem to be that they work as well. And it doesn't seem to be that the people that are in charge of them care as much. So, what about that? What I came up with is that the systems out here, instead of being optimized like to serve you or have a successful run, they're more optimized just to kind of survive criticism. And failure doesn't actually disqualify anybody anymore. And when you're talking about government, we're lucky if we even know it is a failure. Both sides say that everything that the other side does is a failure. The thing that we have to keep working on is the idea that we're able to, do something, check back on it, and then actually see if it worked, right? Because we have a really hard time giving that information. Everything's a launch. Nothing is a check back. No one's going back to say, hey, that big launch about this project that was going to happen last year or whatever, how did that go? How often do you hear about that? Almost never. So here's what I was thinking. If failure doesn't actually disqualify anybody anymore, projects are going to do what? They just fail upwards, right? One bad idea gets stacked on top of another one. And the responsibility is diffused. Committees, consultants, that's their problem. That's the Republicans' problem. That's the Democrats' problem. That's the socialists' problem. Well, the socialists have a lot more problems. People used to take ownership of things, right? They don't seem to be doing that now. All they're interested is getting some sort of plausible deniability. And you just can't get competence when you do that. Here's an example here for where I'm at on the Western Slope, right? couple of the counties near me, Mesa County and Garfield County, have been saying that they don't want to enforce laws made by the state that come with no funding, that require things to be done, money to be spent, but nothing to follow up. It's easy to sit in the state house, have an IQ of 48, and say, oh, I'm going to solve this problem by writing a note, and then we'll make it law, and then everybody else can fix it. Yeah, it almost always requires some sort of resources. And the resources are never attached to anything anymore. The state just passes laws. Counties are told to enforce them. No money, no staff, no infrastructure is provided at all. It is move along to something else. That's not really governance. That's sort of wish casting. Like, well, we took care of that. Let's move on to something else. And you forget about what you just did. And the local people around me have been saying, if you want outcomes, you give some resources to do that. Otherwise, you're just transferring risk and liability to somebody else. And you get to say that you dealt with the problem, and if something goes wrong, it's like, well, they didn't implement it properly. Well, isn't part of the responsibility of having somebody do something or making them is to making sure that they have the tools available to do it? I mean, in any other kind of job, that would be the question, wouldn't it? If you told somebody to go build a doghouse and had them come over, they go in the backyard there, but you didn't give them any lumber, there's nothing to plug any tools into, and then come out, well, where's the doghouse? I told you to put one up. Well, yeah. There's no tool to work with it, or I can't plug any in, and we don't have the resources. I mean, it's not that hard. And we get more and more of that. As I've said before, I used to stack the statute books up every year and compare it to the last year, and you could see each stack after a year was taller than the stack before. That's just stuff. Ideas that they think they need to do, but no follow-through on them. So they just get bigger and bigger, and they get in each other's way in terms of the ideas, and no one really sorts it out. I always have this vision of people at the legislature or, even on a national level, but right now we're talking about a state level, of just sort of reading something in the paper. Well, they don't read in the paper anymore. They heard something, perhaps on, some television program they were watching or something, or some political, what if we say, some political program that they've been watching. And so they decide, by golly, I got to do something about that. First of all, half the time, it doesn't have anything to do with your local area. We've nationalized all these problems. It's a problem that you hear that's coming out of someplace else, and it seems like it's happening near you because it gets broadcast to everybody. It gets talked about. And because it gets broadcast and talked about, politicians want to go do something about it, because then it makes them look like they're what? They're doing something about it. And the easiest thing to do something about is, I sponsored a bill. Really? Okay. And the bill did what? All right, fine, yeah. And what did you do to make sure that the bill was successful? Well, that's not my job. Yeah, it kind of is. If you're going to impose something on someone, you should give them the tools to make sure that it can be successful. And that's not happening. So you're just transferring that risk, like I said. And this all goes into like what's going on in California and other places. The permitting processes for like building or doing almost anything are just getting slower and slower. More bureaucratic, more self-checking, more endless runaround. It takes longer, services degrade, citizens pay the price, but not the lawmakers for the most part. We need actual operational competence. Doesn't that sound crazy? Yeah, I know. There's plenty of policy language. There's plenty of people that are process-oriented, but they're not action-oriented. And there's a difference. A lot of people love the process, and they mistake the process for actual action. You have a problem in your community, and there's plenty of people that want to have a meeting about it and perhaps a task force to deliver a report, and they actually think that all by itself has somehow really addressed the problem. Well, it might be the first step, but it's certainly not done anything yet. but they see the process as problem solving. And it's not. You just have to listen to the way people talk. If they always want to offer you a program as an answer, you gotta wonder why. We're back. Change that tune. Oh, thanks for sticking with us back here, the second segment here. You know, and we were talking about competence, right? We were talking because it seemed like a lot of people are talking this week, and it's probably because they were traveling and so forth, that they just kept running into this sort of roadblock of incompetence, indifference. That's another one. And what happened there? And doesn't there consequences at some point for that? If you were rude to customers, for instance, or they weren't getting what they wanted, wasn't there somebody tried to fix that? And it's not just government that's happening in it. It's more pronounced in government. But it seems to be happening in anything large, you see it right away. And they don't want to go outside the box that they're in. Nobody says, can we do this? They say, well, it's just been approved. No one wants to say no at the top, so they just let things kind of cruise along. Because what happens then is everybody says no at the bottom, which is you, the customer or the person that the government's trying to service. And decision-making just becomes radioactive. Nobody wants to make a decision. Why should they? Decision makes them have to do something, and perhaps somebody might look over and say they made the wrong decision. So it's easier to make no decision. And no decision is to say no. It sounds like a decision most of the time, but about 75% of the time, it's not a decision. It is an evasion. So as conservatives, we like to talk about accountability. You know, a serious society and government requires institutions that can actually do things. If you don't have competence, then people don't have trust. If you can't run a state or a county or a country, you can't do it on unfunded mandates, crossed fingers, and the hope that things will somehow just work out. It's a scary thing. And it contributes to this general feeling of collapse that we have right now. It doesn't mean we're headed necessarily for that Mad Max environment that I kind of want because I like the vehicles. But beyond that, we're not quite headed for that yet, but we're just sort of grinding like we talked about down. So we talked in the first segment there about that collapse of that competence. So, but how did we get there? I mean, people didn't suddenly get dumber. They've always been stupid for the most part, particularly people we put in office. One of the people that I really like to read, H.L. Mencken, wrote a lot about politics, very caustic, very funny in a caustic way, in the 20s and almost into the 30s. And as much as he detested dumb politicians, which there were plenty of, and programs, he was almost more mad at the people that kept voting them in. And people who complain about what's going on, but they keep giving power and authority to people that have been doing the things that they don't like. That's a really interesting thing to take a look at. And it's because we don't seem to insist on competence anymore. Certainly not in politicians, and sometimes not even in regular big businesses that we interact with. That some of them are large enough to where they feel like government. Some of them are bigger than governments. In a functioning institution, you know, you got authority and you got responsibility. If you fail, you have some kind of consequences. We talk all the time about the fact that you can fail in some projects, particularly in government, and you can lose a lot of money. It can be a bad idea, and you just act like it never happened, and you just divert more tax money to fill in the back of what happened and then move on to something else. It's harder to do that in business, but it can be done if the business is big enough and has enough extra money in its pockets. So it's just sort of a sorting kind of thing. Nobody was upset when things were going a little better if you made a mistake. But if you kept repeating that mistake, there was some kind of consequence to it. Today, if you fail someplace in a large institution or government, it's just absorbed, right, diffused kind of, and just get rebranded as maybe success. Or we haven't got enough time to study that yet. So no one fixes the problem. And you, the person who's supposed to be serviced by either something that you're buying or paying taxes on, something, you're the one that's left dangling out there. Part of it might be that we've lost this kind of apprenticeship idea, and not just in the great services like plumbing, electrical, anything like that, but just in general. You learn from someone who had done the job well. Skills got passed on in institutions. I mean, we had trades like we talked about. In the law where I'm at, people would go to firms and learn from people who have been doing it a long time, back when they were not interested in just jumping out and bothering you from billboards. Medicine was the same way. Law enforcement, of course, the military. Getting judgment about a problem, you can't just download it like a computer program. People have to have some experience with it, and you have to get some experience from people who've done it, just kind of guide you along. We don't have that anymore. And because of that, we don't have any meritocracy. In other words, people aren't promoted and rewarded for doing things well. I mean, meritocracy was never pure. I mean, people talk about that. But there's always been nepotism and confusion and just, shall we say, scallywagism, where people are trying to get away with things in systems. That's always happened. But it wasn't so bad that it functioned, that it didn't function, rather. Because in the end, performance mattered because people expected that it would perform. We're getting to the point now where we expect it not to perform. And that leads to an idea of just kind of giving up. Because, well, that's what I thought would happen. Well, the fact that you thought something that should happen didn't happen correctly shouldn't give you a feeling of like, oh, well, of giving up. But it does after a while when everything seems to be going that way. Reputation. This was something else I jotted down. In my work, after I got out of law enforcement and what I do now, you know, we do insurance work for people who've been in accidents and so forth, and Lord knows you see a bunch of other people trying to do that as well. But I rely on you folks. We do a little advertising here and there, but I like to think that reputation for doing well, for paying attention to people, for trying to sculpt our representation and what we do to the individual and what's happened to them as much as possible, that's what matters. Because then people translate that on to, they know who can be trusted. Today, we have what someone referred to as presentation over performance, right? I drove by some billboard the other day that says, "We win a lot." What does that mean? And here's the thing about that. When you see slogans like that and things like that, is that sound like it's about you? The customer, the client, the patient, whatever the case may be. Does that feel like it's about you? Doesn't to me. It's not about you. It's about them, the person saying it. Very interesting. They're talking about something that reflects on them. Now, they'd like to think it's merit, but it's just really outcome. You assume there must be merit, but you don't know anything about it. And when you talk to people who've been to colleges and have degrees, and I've said that Victor Davis Hanson points out that any degree that has the word studies in it is probably not something that's going to make you any money. But at least education just prepare you to do things. Even if you were getting a degree in like classical studies or something like history, an employer could look at you and say, well, this person has learned some skills. They had an interest. They did well. They had to study. They had to organize things. They had to be able to write. They had to be able to answer questions. They had to be tested and pass those tests. So even though their degree may not be in something we do, the skill set that they developed to get that degree is what we need. You can't get that now because the skill sets to do these things are not what's important. It's the ideological framework that gets built, and that doesn't help you. If someone gets an English degree in some of these places now, they're not going to come into your business and be able to help you write things better, particularly. It's not really about English like it used to be. It's a lot more about other stuff. You get to dissect works of other authors, for instance, to see, how they were oppressing people. That doesn't help you in the job market. Even if it were true. Most of the time it's not true. But even if it were, how does that help? How does that help you out there? How does it help the employer? And remember, we don't ask people if they can do the job anymore. People come through the door. This is what people tell me that hire a lot now, because I'm not interviewing lots of people like I used to, and that probably is a good thing for my sanity. But they want to know what you can do for them. Well, it should be implicit. If you do a good job for me, help me as an employer be successful, then if I have a brain in my head, I'm going to reward you for making me successful. But the job here is to make my business successful, not to provide a ladder for you to do whatever it is you want. That seems to be the shift that we get. We don't see the work reward shaping out the way it ought to.
I want a job and a piece of land.
All right, folks. Thanks for sticking with us. I wanted to talk about this topic about competence in government and actually in businesses, larger business. It seems like competency is drifting away even faster. And for some of the same reasons. Because just talking to everybody not everybody, but a number of people, I think probably after the Thanksgiving weekend, there was a lot of that because there were so many problems. People's travel, trying to get into hotels if they needed to, just trying to get things lined out. And it just seemed like that, well, the government wasn't really any help. As a matter of fact, it was obstruction. And a lot of the businesses just either didn't care or couldn't figure it out. So I thought we'd look a little bit this program today about why that might happen. So I did some research, took some notes and stuff, and gosh, when you start thinking about it, there's just a lot of reasons that you can see in everyday society now. And we talked a little bit about education. Education's drifted away from mastery of anything because it used to prepare people to do things. Now, pretty much lots of it just prepares people to talk about things. That's that process problem, process over results. You get the theory divorced from the application. Ideology replaces skill. People have all sorts of credentials, but no ability. We stopped asking, can you do the job, and started asking, can you complete the program? And then get your credential, and then we'll assume that that's all good now. We don't have no reason to think about that. Authority in these kinds of situations used to be earned, and now it's just declared. You got some authority, and this isn't always the way it was, but in the past, and not very long ago, you had to have some competence to get authority. Now, we've all worked for people who had authority that were incompetent, so don't let me make you think that I think this is all universal. But in general, that's what it needs to be. And then people got respect because they had capability. Now, people have authority just because they have the position, and they demand some sort of respect. We could talk about, I don't know, a recent vice president who is out there talking about how needs a marble bust of herself in the Capitol. That's a perfect example. Some people just get placed in a position, and they assume that by virtue of that position, that they should be respected and not criticized. Now, we have an interesting situation here where you respect the job or the office, right? But you don't necessarily respect the person until they do something that makes you feel like they deserve it. That's a fine line to walk. What that means is that you're not disrespectful to someone who's in an office that traditionally you would respect or that is fundamental in your government or your business. But if you separate that from the person, you can work just fine in that. You can respect that position and at the same time think the person should be doing something very different than that they're doing now. And what you get in a lot of these places, and this is like these posters that get put up all over the place, unity, diversity is our strength, I mean, you don't fix competence with all these slogans. You have to have some standards to back those things up. So you end up having all these daily frustrations, right? And a lot of them come from governance failure, as we said earlier. Institutions, as I'm thinking here, when they lose competence, they don't just frustrate people, they lose legitimacy, right? When you see an institution, particularly a government institution, who's just incompetent, not only do you lose respect for that, but the legitimacy of it. In other words, the fact that you think they ought to have the authority to tell someone what to do based on that begins to disappear because you sense they're incompetent. Well, why should people listen to that? And when you lose legitimacy, especially in government, things really start falling apart, as easy to see. We just end up with politicians talking about things that they can't do or don't know enough about, but they just want to say the words. They want to talk about, we're going to pave the roads, we're going to make the courts better, we're going to have insurance regulation, the utilities are great. Well, these just end up being abstractions for these people. And yet, at the same time, a lot of these things are the core functions of government. And when a government can't execute effectively, citizens stop believing it deserves any authority. And this is what happens. This is why these things start slipping away and people become so disrespectful. Some of it is because they're educated to be disrespectful anymore. And some of it is because they don't look upon the institutions as deserving of it. And that may not be something we want to see in a society, but you can at least understand what it comes from. The modern governmental model, anyway, and as I said, some of the big businesses are the same way, increasingly looks like they run by press releases, task forces, commissioning studies, making announcements about things they're going to do, but they don't talk about outcomes. And they also don't tell you the one thing that is important in your daily life that you just accept without even thinking about it, is how do you know when the job is successful? You know in your job if something's successful. Why is it that you can't find something in government that's a measure of success? Programs come and go. Projects go up. Things happen. Regulations go in. And then that's it. You don't know if they're successful or not. Well, you sense a lot of them are not successful, but nobody comes back. Nobody checks on it. There's no consequence for it. If you're working in a private industry and whatever product you're sculpting doesn't work, you hear about it. Customers won't buy it, or they keep returning it, or they ask you to fix it. Think about how that doesn't happen in government these days. And why is that? Well, it's probably because people are so focused on other things. It used to be people wanted to have things run well. They just expected it. And when it didn't happen, they became disturbed by that and tried to figure out what they needed to do about it, which is usually replace some politicians. But now we're distracted by so many different things. We've allowed interest groups, pressure groups as they like to say, to just identify everything as some sort of ism, some sort of sexism, racism, anti-transism, whatever you want to say, so that our focus is lost on say, okay, fine, you're talking about this stuff, but why don't we have any outcome that we can measure? And when something does come along that's measurable, it's almost always a disaster. That's the only way we know about it. That's not a way to run a railroad or government or a popsicle stand. Because legislatures just end up, at this point, just pass laws. They don't have a plan for how to execute them. We talked about that earlier. legislatures this is an unfunded mandate problem. They pass a law, they, dust their hands off and say, well, that's it, I took care of that problem. Right. Well, how's it going to be executed? Who's going to do it? How are they going to pay for it? What are the consequences if they don't do it? When will you go back and review what you just did to see if that was successful or not? And who will you tell? These things never get answered anymore. You get all this authority gets exercised, and there's no responsibility with it. And unfunded mandates anymore aren't even ideological. Both sides of the political spectrum do it. They're detached from actual governance, and they're more interested in sound bites. I know that sounds facile, but it's true. I mean, I watched some of the hearings on social media this week, and the senators that I watched from the left and the right all talked about how bad this was, and we got to do something, and this and that. And it became quite obvious that they didn't have any idea what they're talking about, had no idea of what you needed to impose if you're going to solve this problem of social media harming kids. And if you want to say, well, no one under a certain age should be able to be on social media, nobody thinks about asking someone, how would we do that? How does that work? And they won't. They're going to, down the line, and you see it coming, you impose some generic legislation that says, you need to do this. You need to make sure that these guys aren't going to be accessing social media until they're old enough. Okay, that's fine. But first of all, shouldn't have a little more guidance in there? And maybe, and this is something I always ask and we never get, is maybe you should have a review. Maybe you should say that everything you do that is a law like that it's a mandatory review of its success or failure within 2 years, 2 years, whatever. Now, I know it'll all just be government mumbo-jumbo, but it'll be something instead of just mandating it. And mandating it in a way that it's clear that you don't understand the situation. You don't understand the technology. You don't understand how things work. You don't do these things. You're not involved with the social media that's causing all these problems. You know nothing about it. We might as well just go to some island someplace and ask someone to solve this problem, because that's about this level of involvement that we get from most politicians anymore. I saw Dick Durbin talking about this from Illinois, and he was, it was just sort of an elongated soundbite. Like, yeah, we all agree that's bad. We don't want to have this stuff happen again. Yeah, no kidding. And besides just saying, stop it, what would you suggest we do? Maybe you should get some people into the room who run these kinds of things and get some suggestions about how you might tailor legislation or regulation so that it's not just blasted out there and has no groundwork with it. And a lot of this regulation just becomes burdensome without solving the problem. You guys know that. Government gets so detached when that kind of thing. Some of our large corporations, of course, are starting to feel like government themselves. Airlines, insurance companies, good Lord, the healthcare systems. And obviously the tech platforms. We feel like that they're so big and so impersonal that nobody really cares. And I have this where we're working on something, say we wanted to put something out on, say we wanted to run a little ad, a little static ad on the internet someplace, and we go to Google, who pretty much controls that now, and you're trying to figure out how to do that. And you try and do that, and you have a problem and it doesn't work. It gets rejected or whatever the case may be. You can't find anybody at that business to help you. If you send an email to them, you're not even sure that anybody's reading it. And anymore, if you send an email to them and it does get read, you're not sure it's a person. Or a person that English is maybe their third language. So you're just throwing these problems out and they just disappear to the wind. And so that's starting to feel a lot like the way the government does. We have to figure out if we, for instance, this thing about access, We have to figure out how people get access to some of these things and how we can use that access to have some sort of gatekeeping to keep it away from vulnerable kids. I mean, I don't think there's any disagreement from the vast majority of Americans that social media is damaging to kids if it's used all the time. Especially since they can now access that kind of stuff out of your sight as a parent. You give them a smartphone, you have no idea what they're doing. There's some apps and some things you can try and put on them, but those work not particularly well. So your child is out there with a computer that, made the one that had the last moon landing look like an abacus, and you're not real sure what they're doing with it. And they're not either. They're just still exploring. You know why? Because they're kids. That's what kids do. All of you can think back at things that you did when you were exploring things and doing stuff that your parents might not thought was a particularly good idea. Kids do that. That's why parents have to be alert. How do parents be alert to something like this? They're not involved in it. You have to start somehow being a gatekeeper over that. Government should help that with some reasonable regulations, but if they write a bunch of nonsense, then all it'll do probably is cause problems in the areas that we need that technology to excel and not really address the problem. How many times does this happen? Well, it's happened enough to where the electorate just doesn't trust the institutions anymore. I mean, I think we've all been suspicious of government power. That's sort of an American thing. As a people, a free people, it's sort of the defining characteristics of Americans that we're happy to have some governance, but we're going to keep our eye on it. We don't think it was devolved from some kingship or some sort of relationship with a bunch of people from 2,000 years ago that now make you a king or whatever. I know we have these protests, no kings. Those people don't know what they're talking about. We've got people out there, cornering the Christy Nome from Homeland Security and calling her Gestapo and names that are associated with National Socialism. I think we should always call it National Socialism because that's what it is. And the people saying it don't have a faintest idea what they're talking about. They have an idea in their head what they think they're saying, but they don't know what the actual reference is. These things are actual organizations. They were actual things. They did actual acts. There were consequences. They're not just some made-up, dirty word that you think up and throw at people. You cheapen them by doing that. It's really, really disturbing. And this kind of stuff has to apply to government and all regulations and everything else. We have to define it. We have to make sure that we know what we're talking about. And we have to demand that the people that are making the rules about something can have some kind of expertise in it. And then go back and see if it worked. I mean, there's like 4 steps in there, and that's it. We just can't seem to get them done. I mean, what would it actually look like if we were able to get government to be more competent? And I think government was more competent probably in the 60s, let's say, and into the 70s. 80s, we started to see things slip. And I'm not talking about Ronald Reagan. I'm talking about a lot of things that started to demonstrate we had a society that was too comfortable for too long. We decided that because we heard some bad stories about mental institutions, we just shouldn't have them anymore. We should just let people out on the street and, and maybe they'll take their meds. We decided that orphanages all were bad because we had some very bad stories. And instead of coming up with another institution that we could have some control over, we farm people out to places that there's no way that we have enough people to regulate where you're sticking all these kids. And that's, I think, where things started right there in some of this societal stuff. Homelessness went up. Homelessness is not just hobos from the old days or people that like to live on the street or on the move, because there are people like that. People who are completely, in control of their faculties. That's just what they want to do. But a lot of them have very bad mental health problems, and they have substance abuse problems. Now, those things often go hand in hand, don't they? You have a substance abuse problem maybe because you're trying to medicate your mental health problem. And, of course, since you're doing it that way, chances are you're just making it worse, or you're numbing yourself out so that you don't know what you're actually doing. Doesn't mean you're not doing it. This means you're not aware of it. So when we started turning all these people out on the streets, we're harming society and we're harming them. And the fact that we won't insist on something being addressed by that is, maybe it says something about the electorate. Because if the electorate is smart enough, and you people out here, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, you people listening to this kind of radio station and this kind of speaking that we're doing, you already know a lot of this stuff. You know, you can't judge a competency of a government by how much it promises you, stuff especially. What we want is a government that does a few things that are necessary for government to do, because there are more problems if individuals do it than the problems that arise when government do it. And we'd like to see that government owns the results, so that there's some kind of recursive thing in there, right? That didn't work, let's try something else. We're not seeing that. That didn't work, let's do more of it. Because we have, apparently, a very deep pocket. And that deep pocket is you. Corporations can't even do that. They have to have you hand them things. The government just reaches in there and gets it. There has to be some sort of visibility. People talk about transparency in government. And what I think when I hear transparency is, yeah, we can't see anything. We just see right through it. I don't want transparency. I want the availability of the image so I can see what's going on. I don't want to look through it. I don't want it to be a mirage or some sort of mirror image of something. I want it to be a functioning mechanical, if we want to say it that way, or a functioning mechanism that I can put the hood up on and look at and see what it's doing. I'm not interested in that transparency that they're constantly talking about, right? I want the transparency so that I can, the type of thing where I can lift the hood and see what's happening. That's what I want. So what's happened here? Well, competency declines. There's no enforcement mechanisms for people that are incompetent. And the government becomes some sort of abstraction. And the corporations pick up a lot of that power and responsibility that government should have, because it's just laying there. Now, a society that cannot demand competence from those who govern it is eventually going to be governed by those it can't remove.
Hi, folks. Thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.